Welcome to Infidelity Diaries. Explore the secrets and stories of infidelity with us. You might say that our lives are a series of decisions, each leading to the next. But sometimes, one seemingly insignificant decision can change everything. I never thought that a simple choice, inviting an old friend over for dinner, would set off a chain of events that would turn my world upside down. Maybe you'll judge me, maybe you'll understand. But this is my story, and I'll tell it to you as it happened. So, let's start from the beginning. Every morning began the same way. I would wake up in my bed, feeling the warmth of David lying beside me, my husband, the man I had spent the last 10 years with. His breathing was steady and calm, and there was something soothing in that sound. Our home was our sanctuary, a place where I felt safe. But lately, despite this calm atmosphere, a strange feeling had been growing inside me, a feeling that something was missing. David had always been a good husband, caring, attentive, and, most importantly, reliable. But in this reliable comfort, in this stability, a void began to emerge. At first, I ignored it, attributing it to ordinary fatigue or temporary work difficulties. But over time, it became clear that it was something more than just exhaustion. One evening, David came home with a smile on his face and announced that his old college friend, Caleb Harper, was returning to town and wanted to see us. I remembered Caleb, a tall, confident guy with an infectious smile and a sharp sense of humor. In college, he was the center of attention, always surrounded by friends and admirers. I agreed to the meeting, though inside me was a strange premonition that I couldn't explain. When Caleb arrived at our home, everything seemed normal. He greeted David warmly, and we began talking, reminiscing about the good old days. However, something changed when our eyes met. It was a fleeting sensation, but it left a mark on me. His eyes lingered on mine a fraction of a second longer than they should have. I looked away, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. That evening, we spent a lot of time together. David, Caleb, and I sat at the table, drinking wine and chatting. Laughter and conversation filled the room, but somewhere inside me, a strange unease began to grow. I found myself increasingly drawn to Caleb, to his gestures, to his manner of speaking. I felt a spark ignite in my chest, a long-forgotten sense of excitement that I hadn't felt in years. When Caleb went to leave, I, as usual, saw him to the door. He thanked us for the evening, but before he left, his gaze met mine once more. This time it lingered longer, and I felt something in that look pulling me in, as if an invisible connection had formed between us, one that couldn't be ignored. I quickly looked away, saying goodbye, but his image stayed with me, even after the door closed behind him. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about that evening. Every detail, every look and gesture from Caleb replayed in my mind over and over. I tried to convince myself that it was just the result of boredom or a monotonous life, but it didn't help. Deep down, I knew it was something more. A few days later, David mentioned that Caleb wanted to meet again. I felt mixed emotions, joy at the chance to see him again and fear of what might happen, but I agreed. We met again at our home, and this time, I was even more attentive to his every move, every word. With each new glance, with each new conversation, the tension between us grew, something that couldn't be ignored. But we both stayed silent, as if afraid to break the fragile balance that kept us from crossing the line. I didn't know what to do. This attraction, this passion that had begun to awaken in me, was something new, something I couldn't control. I understood that this could lead to disaster, but I couldn't stop myself. I was scared, but at the same time, I felt alive, as if something long forgotten had awakened inside me. These feelings, these moments stayed with me, even when Caleb was gone. Every time I was alone, I thought of him. And every time I tried to talk to David, I felt guilty, even though nothing had happened yet. But I knew it was only a matter of time. That evening, I thought I could suppress my feelings, stifle the growing excitement that was overwhelming me. But it turned out that desire is something that doesn't obey reason. It becomes a part of you, clouds your thoughts, and drives you to places you never imagined going before. This is a story about how a desire, born in the shadows of an ordinary life, starts to control your every step. Several weeks had passed since Caleb first appeared at our house. I tried to continue living as before, convincing myself that it was just a fleeting infatuation, that nothing had really changed. But every time I was alone, I felt his image resurfacing in my mind. His smile, his voice, even his fleeting touches left an imprint on my memory that I couldn't shake off. Our meetings with Caleb became more frequent, and each time he came, the tension between us became more palpable. It was like a game of cat and mouse, where both players know the rules, but neither dares to make the first move. We avoided talking about what was lingering in the air, but that only made the tension grow stronger. One evening, when David was once again late at work, Caleb stopped by unexpectedly. I heard the doorbell ring, and my heart raced when I saw him at the door. He stood there with the same confidence as always, but there was something new in his eyes, something that made me freeze. "I thought you might be bored alone," he said, lifting a bag of wine. "I decided to keep you company." I knew I should have refused, but instead, I invited him in. We sat in the living room, talking about the usual things: work, friends, plans for the future. But every time our eyes met, I felt an electric charge between us that was impossible to ignore. Caleb began talking about how hard it was for him to return to this town after so many years, how he felt like a stranger in a place that was once his home. His voice grew quieter, and in his words, I sensed something more than just a desire to chat. It was a confession, an admission that his heart was searching for something it had lost. "Sometimes I think I've missed out on the most important thing in my life," he said, his gaze lingering on me, "and now I can't get it back." Those words awakened something deep inside me. I understood what he was talking about, but I was afraid to admit it even to myself. I felt my hands start to tremble, and I tried to hide it by gripping the wine glass more tightly. But Caleb noticed, and without saying a word, approached me. He slowly knelt in front of me, his face so close that I could hear his breathing. "I can't pretend anymore that this is just friendship." His voice was barely audible, but it carried a determination that stripped me of the last remnants of willpower. "You feel it, just like I do." I couldn't respond. My thoughts were jumbled, and my heart was beating so fast that it felt like it would burst from my chest. But before I could say anything, he leaned closer, his lips just inches from mine. I could feel his warmth, feel his breath mingling with mine, and I knew that this was the moment that could change everything. But I didn't allow myself to give in to this feeling. With tremendous effort, I pulled away, stood up, and moved away from him, feeling tears well up in my eyes. Caleb remained where he was, his face a mix of pain and understanding. He knew that this step was inevitable, but he also knew that the time wasn't right yet. "I'm sorry," was all I could manage, trying not to look at him. "Don't apologize," he replied calmly, standing up. "It's not your fault." He left, leaving me in complete silence. I stood in the living room, listening to his footsteps fade away, and I couldn't hold back the tears. At that moment, I realized that this attraction, this passion that was bursting forth, was real. I knew I could no longer ignore it, but I also understood that this step could destroy everything I had built over the years with David. I was left alone, feeling two forces battling within me: my love for my husband and the passion I had begun to feel for his friend. I knew that this was only the beginning, that the fire inside me would burn stronger with each passing day. But what to do next, I didn't know. This choice that I would soon have to make seemed unbearable, and I felt that any path I chose would lead to the loss of something important. A few days had passed since that evening when Caleb and I nearly crossed the line that could have destroyed everything. I tried to avoid thoughts of him, tried to return to my normal life with David, but it proved impossible. Every morning, I woke up with the feeling that something was wrong, that a part of me was left behind in that room where Caleb almost kissed me. At work, I was distracted, and at home, I was tense. David seemed not to notice anything, or perhaps he simply didn't want to. He was absorbed in his work, his own affairs, and our relationship seemed to continue along the well-worn path of routine. But inside, everything was different. I could feel the tension growing with each passing day. Then, one evening, when I had almost forgotten about that encounter, the phone rang. Caleb's name flashed on the screen. My heart started pounding again. I didn't know what he was going to say, but deep down, I already knew I wouldn't be able to resist. "Hi!" His voice was quiet but determined. "I was thinking, maybe you'd like to come over. To my place." My first thought was to refuse. It was too dangerous, too risky. But the image of that evening, when we almost let ourselves go further, came to mind. I could no longer fight this feeling. I agreed. When I pulled up to his house, my hands were trembling. I knew that this step could change everything, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Caleb met me at the door with the same confident smile as always, but in his eyes, I saw the same uncertainty that I felt in mine. We walked into the living room, and I noticed how he studied me carefully, as if trying to read my thoughts. But I had already made up my mind. At that moment, all doubts, all fears receded into the background. I knew I hadn't come here just for nothing. Caleb moved closer, and I felt his warmth beginning to envelop me. His hands gently touched my waist, and I held my breath, feeling my heart skip a beat. At that moment, I could no longer hold back. I pressed against him, and he leaned in to kiss me. This kiss was more than just the meeting of our lips. It held all the passion we had been suppressing for so long. I felt his hands gliding over my body, exploring every inch as if he wanted to memorize me forever. We moved to the bedroom, and I felt the tension that had been building up all these weeks finally finding its release. Caleb gently laid me down on the bed, and I felt him undress me slowly, savoring every moment. His lips left trails of kisses on my skin, and I couldn't hold back a moan as his hands began to explore me. Every touch was like a flash of fire, every caress like an explosion of passion. I felt us merging into one, our bodies finding a shared rhythm, our souls fusing into one. It was a moment when time ceased to exist, when there was only us and our desire. I sensed how his movements quickened, how the tension inside me reached its peak. We were on the edge, and at that moment, I knew I could never return to my old life. When it was over, I lay in his arms, feeling his breath slowly calming down. At that moment, I thought of nothing but what had just happened. I knew we had crossed a line, after which there would be no turning back, but that no longer frightened me. I felt a new life ignite inside me, and everything that had come before lost its significance. Caleb gently ran his hand through my hair, and I looked into his eyes. There was so much warmth, so much tenderness in them, that I felt my heart start to skip a beat once more. We remained silent, but in that silence, there were more words than we could have ever spoken. I knew that we were now bound, that this attraction, this passion that had arisen between us, would never fade away. The next day, after my encounter with Caleb, I woke up with a heavy heart. Everything that had happened left me with conflicting emotions, a mix of guilt, shame, and satisfaction. I knew I had crossed a line, but I couldn't bring myself to regret it. The memories of that night kept resurfacing in my mind, and each recollection of his touches, his kisses, the sensations made my heart race. That morning, David was unusually attentive. It seemed he sensed that something had changed, although I tried to act as if everything was normal. We had breakfast together, discussing our plans for the weekend, and I caught myself already mentally anticipating my next meeting with Caleb. But at the same time, fear filled me. What if David suspected something? What if he already knew? I spent the entire day on edge, trying to hide my emotions and avoid making direct eye contact with my husband. But in the evening, when David mentioned that Caleb had invited us to dinner, I felt the ground slip from under my feet. I didn't know how to react. Why had he suddenly decided to invite both of us? What did it mean? We drove to Caleb's place together, and on the way, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was a trap. Caleb knew I would feel uncomfortable, knew how hard it would be to pretend in front of David. But at the same time, I realized that he wasn't doing this without a reason. Perhaps it was his way of showing that our relationship wasn't as deep as I thought. Or, on the contrary, it was his game, one that he was pulling both of us into, relishing every minute. When we arrived at Caleb's house, I felt my hands trembling. He greeted us at the door as if nothing had happened, with the same friendly smile as always. I forced myself to smile back, though inside, everything was churning. We sat down at the table, and dinner began like an ordinary evening among friends. David and Caleb talked, joked, and discussed various matters. But I felt a taut, invisible thread of tension between us, one that no one but the two of us could see. At one point, when David was distracted, Caleb looked at me, and in his gaze, I read what he wanted to convey. This dinner was a test, and he wanted to make sure I could handle it. But what struck me the most was the lack of doubt in his eyes. He knew I wouldn't betray him, knew I would continue playing this dangerous game. After dinner, Caleb suggested that David join him in his study to show him something interesting. They left, leaving me alone in the living room. I sat there, unsure of what to do, when suddenly I heard footsteps behind me. It was Caleb. He came up behind me, leaned in, and whispered in my ear, "You're handling this better than I expected." His words made me freeze. I felt his breath scorching my neck, and I knew he was playing with fire, but I couldn't stop. Caleb gently ran his hand down my back, and I felt my nerves tighten like strings. At that moment, I realized he was enjoying this game, that he was deriving pleasure from the risk. But before I could say anything, we heard David's footsteps. Caleb quickly stepped back, returning to his usual role. I looked at him, and he simply smiled as if nothing had happened. When we got home, I felt drained, as if I had gone through some sort of ordeal. But instead of feeling relief, I kept replaying that dinner in my head. Every word, every glance. I understood that the game had become even more dangerous, that now Caleb was testing not only me, but also his own limits. That night was filled with anxiety and turmoil. I lay in bed next to David, feeling him peacefully sleeping, and couldn't find any rest. Inside me, two forces were battling, guilt and the desire to continue. I knew that this path led nowhere, but I couldn't turn back. Several days had passed since our last dinner at Caleb's place. I tried to act as usual, to hide my feelings, but inside, everything was churning. Every day I woke up with anxiety, fearing that David might suspect something. But he seemed to notice nothing unusual, and I hoped it would stay that way. That day began like any other. David left for work. I got ready to go about my errands, and nothing foreshadowed trouble. But in the evening, when I returned home, I was met by silence, an oppressive, tense silence. I felt my heart start to race, but I tried not to pay it any attention. David came home later than usual. His face was grim, and his eyes cold and wary. He barely looked at me and answered my questions in monosyllables. I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't understand what exactly. Finally, in the evening, as we both sat in the living room, he took out his phone and handed it to me. "Can you explain this?" he asked, and there was steel in his voice. I froze. The phone screen displayed an app I used to exchange messages with Caleb. My heart stopped for a moment when I saw our messages. Brief but unmistakable. I never thought David could see them. I couldn't fathom how this had happened. But when I looked at the screen, everything became clear. I had been using an old tablet that David had given me a long time ago when he bought himself a new one. This tablet was always with me, and I never thought anyone else could access it. But, as it turned out, the device was synchronized with his account. Every message, every photo we exchanged was automatically saved in the cloud, to which David had access. Everything inside me turned upside down. I didn't know what to say. How could I explain this? How could I justify myself? But nothing came to mind. I just stared at the screen, feeling the world around me crumble. Do you have anything to say? David's voice was icy. I looked up at him, and in his eyes, I saw not just anger, but pain. He knew everything. Inside, I felt something tighten, and I realized that there was nothing I could do to change it. I I began, but the words got stuck in my throat. Thoughts raced through my mind. How did this happen? Why hadn't I noticed it earlier? How could I have been so careless? David didn't wait for an answer. He already knew what had been said and done. His question was more rhetorical, an expression of wanting to hear my attempts at justification, wanting to see how far I would go in my lies. How long? His voice softened, but it didn't become any less threatening. A few weeks, I whispered, feeling tears well up in my eyes. David leaned back in his chair as if a knife had been plunged into him. I saw his face change as he tried to grasp the magnitude of the betrayal. His hands clenched into fists, and I knew he was holding back, trying not to explode. The silence between us was heavy and unbearable. Inside, everything was tearing apart. How could you? He finally said, and his voice carried not only rage but unbearable disappointment. I lowered my head, unable to look him in the eyes. All I could do was acknowledge my guilt. I had destroyed everything we had, and I understood that he would never be able to forgive me for this betrayal. David stood up, his movements sharp and deliberate. He walked to the door, opened it, and cast me a glance filled with hatred and contempt. Get out of my house! His voice struck like a blow. Right now! I stood up, feeling the world around me collapse. Gathering my things, I walked past him without meeting his gaze. He said nothing, just closed the door behind me. I was left standing alone on the threshold of our home, which was no longer mine. Everything I had was gone in an instant. I had lost everything, and the worst part was the realization that it was all my fault. When we make mistakes, we rarely realize how deep the consequences will be. I thought I could handle the situation, that I could keep everything under control. But at the moment when I was left alone on the doorstep of our house, I understood that I had lost not only my husband, but everything that was important to me. I stood outside, feeling the cold wind brush against my face. The suitcase in my hand felt heavy, as if it carried the full weight of my mistakes. The door slammed shut behind me, with such force that I flinched. It wasn't just the closing of a door, it was the end of an entire chapter of my life. It was already dark outside, and I had no idea where to go. My mind was blank, and all I felt in my heart was emptiness and pain. Every road led nowhere, and I stood there, unsure of what to do. The only thought that flickered in my mind was Caleb. I instinctively pulled out my phone and dialed his number. The ringing seemed to last forever, until finally, his voice came through on the other end. Hello? Caleb. My voice was hoarse from crying. I need to talk to you. David found out everything. He kicked me out. There was silence on the other end of the line. I expected Caleb to support me, to say something comforting, but instead, I heard a heavy sigh. I don't think that's a good idea, he finally said, his voice cold and distant. You understand that there could never be anything serious between us. My heart stopped. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I had just lost my husband, my home, and now Caleb was telling me that there could never be anything between us? But you, I began, but the words stuck in my throat. You knew from the start that this was just a fling, Caleb continued, and I felt his words hit me like blow after blow. I can't let this ruin my life. I stood there, thunderstruck. All my illusions, all my hopes crumbled in an instant. Caleb had been my salvation, my hope that after all this, I wouldn't be alone. But now I realized that I had been nothing more than a toy in his hands, a diversion he allowed himself for a while. I'm sorry. His voice sounded as if he was talking about something trivial. "I can't help you. I hope you find a way out of this situation." He hung up, leaving me standing in the dark, completely drained. I held the phone in my hand, unable to believe what had just happened. In one day, I had lost everything: my husband, my home, and my hope for a new life. I was left alone, with the suitcase of my mistakes and no idea what to do next. I wandered down the street, not knowing where to go. The world around me felt hostile and cold, and I couldn't find a place where I could feel safe. I walked, ignoring the passers-by, not noticing how my steps led me to the place where I had spent so many happy years with David. Our home, which was now someone else's, now seemed like an unattainable fortress. I stopped at the familiar park where David and I often walked, and I sat down on a bench. I watched the people around me, passing by, and couldn't understand how they could be so calm when my world was falling apart. Tears streamed down my cheeks, and I didn't even try to hold them back. All my life, I had strived for stability, for security, and now I was standing on the ruins of my hopes. I had lost everything that was dear to me and was left alone, without any support, without any foundation. I knew this was the price I had to pay for my mistakes, for my betrayal, but that didn't make it any easier. I felt my strength leaving me, and I didn't know how to cope with this. Time dragged on slowly, as if the world had stopped. I tried to gather my thoughts, tried to think of what to do next, but nothing came to mind. I was lost, and the fear, the uncertainty, was unbearable. I sat on the park bench, and it felt as if the world around me had disappeared. The passers-by, the city noise, the wind. Everything seemed distant, unreal. My mind was engulfed in chaos, and I couldn't find a foothold. Everything I had was gone in an instant. I lost David, lost Caleb, lost the home that had been my refuge for so many years. Now only emptiness lay before me. I tried to understand how I ended up in this situation. My thoughts returned to the day I first felt the pull toward Caleb. What was it? Boredom? A desire to experience something new? Or just a foolish mistake? I knew that at some point I could have stopped, could have chosen a different path, but I didn't. Why? This question tormented me, and the more I tried to find an answer, the deeper I sank into despair. Tears continued to stream down my cheeks, and I made no effort to stop them. Everything I had done had led me to this moment. I had betrayed David, the person who loved me and trusted me more than anything in the world. I had destroyed everything we had built together for the sake of a fleeting infatuation, for something that seemed real to me, but turned out to be just an illusion. My heart ached as if it had been torn apart. I felt the sorrow and pain fill me from within, leaving only emptiness. This emptiness was unbearable, but I knew I deserved it. It was the price for my mistakes, for my weakness. I remembered the moments when David was by my side, when we laughed together, made plans for the future. All those memories now seemed so distant, as if they belonged to another life, a life that would never return. I realized that I had lost not just a husband. I had lost my identity, my future, my confidence that I had a place in this world. Caleb had been my escape, a chance to run away from the routine, from what seemed dull and predictable to me. But now I saw that it was nothing but self-deception. He had never been the one who could replace David. He was just a reflection of my own weakness, my fears, and insecurities. And now, when he had left me, I realized that I was alone, with no support. I tried to find the strength within myself, tried to figure out what to do next, but nothing came to mind. I was shattered, broken, and couldn't find a shred of hope. All I had was the past, which now felt unreachable. I wished I could go back, fix everything I had done, but I knew that was impossible. Hours passed as I sat in that park, lost in my thoughts. People around me came and went, but I remained in place, unable to move. I knew I needed to move forward, to seek a new beginning, but I couldn't find the strength. All I felt was pain and emptiness, and I didn't know how to cope with it. Finally, as it began to get dark, I stood up and started walking aimlessly. My feet carried me through familiar streets, but my mind was in turmoil. I passed by our house, which now seemed foreign to me, and my heart ached with pain. It was a place where I had been happy, but now it had become a symbol of my downfall. I wandered on, not knowing where I was going. There was no plan, no goal ahead. I walked because stopping would have hurt even more. I was trying to run away from my thoughts, from my past, but I knew that was impossible. All I could do was keep walking until I found something that could fill this emptiness. I didn't know how long I had been walking through the city streets. I felt lost, as if the whole world had turned its back on me. But deep down, I understood that it was I who had turned my back on the world, and now I was paying the price for it. I wanted to find forgiveness, wanted to find a path to healing, but I knew that path would be long and difficult. When I finally stopped, I realized I was standing on a familiar bridge. It was a place where David and I often walked on weekends. I approached the railing and looked down at the river that flowed slowly beneath me. The water seemed as calm as it had been the day we first came here together, but now, that calmness only intensified my pain. I stood there, feeling the wind brush against my face, and realized that this was the end. The end of what I knew, the end of the life I had built. And although I was scared, I knew that this was my new path. I didn't know where it would lead me, but I knew I had to walk it to find new meaning in my life. I want you to know, don't repeat my mistakes. Value what you have, and don't let fleeting desires destroy your life. Love, trust, and loyalty are things that cannot be replaced by anything else. I learned this too late, and now I am left to live with this bitter truth.